recording. Alrighty. Hey everyone, my name is Morgan Register and I am currently a graduate research assistant at UNL underneath Dr. Andy Little. It is my pleasure today to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Little as he presents today during our S&R seminar series. This is a fall seminar series that's held weekly, showcasing research and topics from UNL as well as speakers from around the world. As you have probably noticed, seminars are held entirely virtually this year through Zoom and are held every Wednesday from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Some of the previous seminars have been recorded, so if you're interested in seeing them or catching up, please contact Chris Jasinski. The next seminar, which is next Wednesday, October 14th, will be held by Dr. Cecil Jennings. He will be here presenting about assessing the supply and demand for trout in North Georgia under current and projected thermal regimens. To minimize the disruption by Zoom bombers, the chat will be directed straight to the host. So after the talk or during, if any questions come up, please type your questions into the chat to myself or Chris, and we'll direct the questions to Andy for you. Also, please turn off your video in order to minimize any bandwidth issues. So with that being said, I would love to introduce Dr. Andy Little. He is an assistant professor of landscape and habitat management, as well as an extension wildlife specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Little has received his bachelor's in wildlife and fisheries science from Pennsylvania State University, his master's in wildlife ecology from Mississippi State University, and his PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Georgia. He is a wildlife spatial ecologist focused on creating innovative solutions to the growing wildlife conservation and management needs in multifunctional landscapes where there are competing interests for agricultural production, wildlife conservation, and ecosystem services. So join me in welcoming Andy Little.
All right, well, thank you so much, Morgan. First off, can you hear me, and does everything look okay in the screen? Okay, I just want to make sure. There is Zoom, we gotta make sure all those things are checked off. All right, well, thank you again. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. We're going to talk a little bit about prioritizing private lands to optimize biodiversity conservation. And again, thanks for the introduction, Morgan. I really appreciate that. So we're going to start off briefly. We're going to talk a little bit about a changing Midwest landscape and kind of some of the challenges that we face that are not only locally within the Midwest, but I think largely across the world that we face, and we just have to be cognizant of them. And then we're going to dive into this topic of precision conservation delivery, and particularly thinking about how do we target private lands conservation more strategically on the landscape. Before I do that and jump into those topics, I want to mention a couple of different things. One, about our lab here. Check out our awesome lab, our applied wildlife ecology and spatial movement lab that we have. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those social media accounts. You can find out more about our projects on there, about who's in our lab, etc., and what we focus on by going to our website. So my position, before we kind of jump into this at the university, just for those who are not familiar, and how it kind of ties into these topics we're going to talk today about, is I'm an assistant professor of landscape and habitat management, and my specific position is 60% extension, 40% research. And I think about a lot of these topics kind of thinking at a landscape level scale, and how do we prioritize and address some of these challenges that we face. And so I wanted to kind of start off with that and addressing some of these challenges. And I think largely the topics we're going to talk about briefly here, I would say most people are fairly familiar with, but you know, I wanted to talk about them, kind of provide some data to illustrate my point. So one of the big challenges that we obviously face in the Midwest, and I think largely across the world, is habitat loss and degradation. I live in Southeast Lincoln, where my house is actually located. My wife's family, who are originally from Hastings, they remember this specific area actually being in a cornfield about 20 years ago. And so habitat loss and degradation have really changed the landscape, and obviously the wildlife that are using that, and how they get from point A to point B. And so that's a huge issue that we have to face as we're moving into the next 20 to 30 plus years. How do we deal with that? Additionally, with that decline in habitat loss and degradation, we've lost over almost 60% of our vertebrate animals across the world. This is from the World Wildlife Fund. Again, this has been a huge issue, and obviously one of the big drivers of this issue is habitat loss and degradation. Additionally, especially in the Midwest, a lot of agricultural landscapes, we have a landscape simplification, as I tend to refer to it. This graph here is basically a Simpson Diversity Index, and for those who are not necessarily familiar with it, basically what this graph is showing, this is USDA NASS data, so agricultural data, looking at crop diversity on the landscape, and this is out of the Hiller et al. Paper from 2009. And so essentially what it's showing is that trend or that change in the landscape structure and composition over time, particularly tied to crops. So back in the 60s, we had basically our largest diversity or highest diversity of crops on the landscape, but as you can see, it's been declining since. And here's the same or very similar type data, but for corn. Utilizing data from NASS again, we basically see that inverse relationship, which again is not surprising as you're driving down Interstate 80. You can see that, corn soybean rotation, especially in the eastern part of the state. You can also see that landscape simplification from the fields and kind of seeing the change over time. A lot of times when we're driving down the road, we don't really see that because again, it takes time to see those changes. And so this is just some aerial imagery from Lark and Powell's work in 2015 to kind of illustrate that change over time. And so these are just a complex of fields from back in the late 30s. You can see how small these fields are relative to kind of what you would see today. So there's a lot more complexity on the landscape. That same general area over time, you can start seeing those fields, those fence lines are getting removed. We're moving into larger and larger blocks of fields to be more efficient over time, and basically up to today where we're at, which obviously is our more intensive agricultural landscape or center pivot landscape, where we see these very large blocks of fields that are in whatever type of maybe corn, soybean rotation. So again, there's been a significant simplification on the landscape over time. You can also see this from kind of looking at patch diversity. So all the yellow here is agriculture. This is in Otoe County, so just a little east of Lincoln. And so again, you can see all the agriculture, corn, soybeans, pastures, etc. And then the green is actually grassland, intact grassland patches on the landscape. So you have some of those large areas, but again, most of the landscape looks like this. And this is just an example when we think about intensive ag landscape. So a question will be is if you were a pheasant and you lived in some grassland patches kind of surrounded by agriculture, how do you get from point A to point B when you don't have a lot of connectivity of patches? That's a big challenge. And so again, this landscape fragmentation and simplification has really changed the way wildlife utilize the landscape. Concomitantly with that, we see a declining pheasant populations across the board. This is also work from Powell 2015 to illustrate the male carrier surveys that are conducted for pheasants across the state of Nebraska. Not surprisingly, with the simplification, we're seeing a declining pheasant population across the board. With some of our more robust pheasant populations we see, particularly in areas of southwest Nebraska. One of the things I did want to note, and I think this is really important when we think about the landscape, is pheasant hunting in particular is about a $32 million business annually for Nebraska. And this is from the Nebraska, or this is from the Pheasant Management Plan, National Pheasant Management Plan, but specifically for Nebraska. Obviously, that has trickle down effects into our small communities. So we think about hunters that are either in state or out of state coming to these local communities. They're going and stopping the local burger joint. They're going out, getting a hotel somewhere. That has significant impacts if you start seeing declining pheasant numbers across the board. So thinking about the rural vitality of those communities. So I wanted to kind of highlight that because I think it's a really significant piece when we think about the complexity of the issues we're facing. Recreational opportunities are close to home. We have 2/3 of our population in eastern Nebraska, particularly in our metro areas of Lincoln and Omaha. And so as a challenge, we have to deal with, okay, we want to be able to provide those opportunities for folks so they don't have to drive 4 or 5 hours away to recreate, whether that's bird watching, hunting, you name it. You want to be able to provide those opportunities. And how do we do that more strategically on the landscape, given the intensification of our agricultural systems? We also see, again, with the landscape simplification, declines in other species, western meadowlark, grasshopper sparrow, etc. So the point is that landscape simplification has impacted a variety of species on the landscape, not just pheasants only. We also have a growing world population, which is not a surprise. How are we going to address over almost 10 billion people by 2050 and the needs, particularly from the food resources that we have to produce? There's some folks who would say, well, where else could you put more corn rows or soybean rows in Nebraska? But it's not just Nebraska, it's around the world. You see places in South America where they're ripping out many forested stands and put in more agriculture, which obviously that's a competing challenge that we have. We obviously want to manage for our natural resources, but we also have to feed a growing world's population. So how do we do that more strategically? Water issues, another issue in this state, particularly nitrate and atrazine levels are really high in sections of Nebraska, noted here in these red areas. Those areas, particularly, the challenge of how do you mitigate those high nitrate problems into the future to ensure that we have clean water as a part of just the health of it for individuals, and how do we also reduce soil erosion, other aspects that then are leading to issues we see in the Gulf of Mexico. So obviously there's a lot of problems, there are a lot of challenges that we face, and we have to be very creative to address those challenges. And what I'm going to talk about today is not a silver bullet, because that doesn't exist, it's not reality. It's a tool, it's an option that folks could use and being able to prioritize and manage in the landscape more efficiently and strategically. So again, there's a lot of challenges, and there's no way we can tackle all of them under one effort. But the goal is that we can be able to provide some tools or some possibilities to be able to solve some of these challenges. So traditionally, when we would enroll in conservation programs, the method is we'll kind of use this graphic here as an illustration. You're going to have different isolated patches that are across the landscape. And we talked about before, thinking about landscape connectivity and that kind of distribution of where those patches are at. But one of the things we assume is that, if you build that habitat using the Field of Dreams reference, that they'll come. And it's the idea of, okay, if I put habitat out there, automatically I should see some response in pheasants or quail or whatever, pollinators, you just name it. And you definitely can see those cases, but really the question that we have to think about is what happens if we don't see those? What happens if you build those, per se, working with landowners, and you really don't see the actual change in the landscape? Particularly something that maybe that landowner was really interested in. Maybe they're a producer and they're really interested, obviously, in maximizing profitability, but at the same time, they're also thinking, hey, I'd like to have some pheasant hunting opportunities for my grandkids and kids to come out here on the weekend. And so how do I build that? So we're going to kind of take a simple example of a Nebraska landowner. And so for those who are not familiar, if you're trying to enroll lands into a conservation program, typically a landowner would go and meet with a USDA FSA officer or biologist, and they would basically go out and they would identify potential program enrollment on their properties, and basically come back and give them a plan of, here are some options that you could consider if you want to enroll certain sections of your property in a conservation program. So if that landowner then enrolls a portion of their land in CP33 for habitat buffers for upland birds on the landscape, with the intent that they can still try to maximize their whole field profitability, they're trying to make more money on it, but they also want to have a benefit to wildlife as well. The question is, what happens if that landowner comes back to you and says, well, hey, you told me to do this as a biologist, but I'm not seeing this. I'm not seeing a response in deer, songbirds, pheasants, quail, whatever, you kind of name it, pollinators. I'm not seeing the response that I was expecting to receive. And so that as a biologist, you have to kind of think, okay, well, then what do I do? You want to leave that individual happy. You want to show that you're being proactive and not reactive and helping them make the right decision for their land. And so how do you go about doing that, especially if they're not seeing that return on investment that they that they expected to see when they were thinking about implementing a conservation program? Because again, we have kind of this mindset that we just build it and automatically we're going to see a response. And that's the thing I want to kind of challenge everybody to think about today, is thinking about what happens if that doesn't occur. So there's various reasons why you may not see a response. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's too many to name here per se. But I want you to think a little bit about patch connectivity. So when we look at this patch that this producer enrolled, but then we look at all the neighboring parcels around there, we are starting to look back to that challenge I mentioned before about pheasants getting from point A to point B. How do they get from point A to point B when it's intensive row crop production and there really isn't a way to be able to connect patches from point A to point B? There's just not a lot of connectivity. The initial assumption is, okay, well, yeah, when the crops are up, they'll move through the fields, and maybe to some degree they would. The species will move through those fields when the crops are up. But when the crops are down and you have to move through a field, how do you get from point A to point B without experiencing potentially high risk levels? So thinking about it from kind of the predation risk side of things, if I'm a pheasant trying to go through a cut cornfield, I'm at a very high risk of predation, because now I'm exposed because there's not much cover around, and I'm trying to get to some other patch. And the assumption also is that they know that there are other patches out there. Obviously, if they're trying to disperse from one place to another, they're trying to disperse through common, maybe a road ditch or other areas where they have at least some cover to kind of create to reduce that risk on the landscape for them. And so if they don't have it, you're kind of sitting duck per se. And so what happens is you basically create these ecological traps, or basically sinks in the landscape when you have very isolated patches. And so what happens where the predators are at, and kind of think about this in reality of your own life. If you only had a couple of patches you had to go search in the landscape, well, you'd have, and it had fairly good success rates, well, that's what you would do. Now, if you have a diversity of patches in the landscape, it makes it a lot harder to find those prey resources. So think about the patch connectivity, patch size, how big that patch is. If the patch is only a couple of acres and the majority of your landscape is basically non-habitat per se for wildlife, that has a factor. Predators, you can kind of couple them in with the patch size and patch connectivities on the landscape. So the point is landscape context is critical. And this image here is to kind of illustrate these dark green areas is basically patches on the landscape, and these light green areas basically serving as corridors from point A to point B. And so again, it's important when we think about landscape context and kind of the landscape management when we're thinking about conservation enrollment and conservation implementation. So that leads us to the topic of precision conservation. And again, I think it's really an innovative approach to land management. I am not the one who dreamed this up. I think there's some great folks who really kind of started this effort. I'm trying to take it and expand it further here into Nebraska. So precision conservation, for those who are not familiar, really is an approach to help our biologists on the ground with allocating funding to encourage private landowners to adopt conservation programs. And really, it's a way to be able to strategically target money, or more surgically target that money in a way that we can have the best bang for the buck for us as a, say an agency or organization, but then also from a producer side of things, where we can kind of, work collectively as a team to be able to basically get win-win solutions, or in other words, for a producer, helping them maximize that profitability, which is really an exciting avenue, especially when you have large pieces of equipment you have to pay off. So as I mentioned earlier, we have this kind of traditional, I consider it kind of a shotgun pattern approach. And part of this is by design, obviously. There's only so many acres to go around, so much money to go around. We can't, it's not like we have unlimited bank accounts to be able to go implement conservation on the landscape. That's just not reality. But again, if we're kind of having this kind of a shotgun pattern implementation, are there ways that we can be more targeted in that? And so kind of that's leading to this idea of, again, targeted or kind of precision conservation. And so we continue to expand that effort, and we start having these kind of key areas that we're focusing on for management. So we think about kind of conservation opportunity areas. This is from Nebraska Game and Parks, and we think about with the pheasant opportunity areas that they have within the state. And so the question is, well, okay, well, that's a fairly large area, say in the Northeast pheasant opportunity area. Where do you actually, even within there, you know, those counties are fairly large, where do you actually target that money? So that's kind of the aspect of thinking about precision conservation, and it's a multi-scale focus. So you can't, it's not just at a regional or local scale, it's a multi-scale focus that we're really looking at. And part of my previously, when I was in Mississippi, I actually worked for Ducks Unlimited as a GIS analyst for them. And that's part of the idea that they had when they were trying to implement conservation, particularly wetland conservation. You know, we have the traditional model is we would send a biologist out, pen and paper, map, and then drive around, knock on doors, and see who was interested in conservation program enrollment. Well, that became obviously fairly inefficient of doing that. And so then it was, okay, can we prioritize or target areas where we can maybe have the best bang for the buck? And then we can be more strategic in how we implement not only the conservation, but obviously sending our biologists out on the landscape. So obviously we all, you know, we have limited manpower per se to get out there. We have limited money, we have limited time. We can't do everything under the sun. It would be ideal to be able to do that, to be able to implement conservation broadly, but that's just not realistic. And so we have obviously some sideboards per se and parameters that constrain us that we have to consider when we're implementing conservation. So given these constraints, you know, how do you target conservation enrollment? And so this graph here, this image here is we're going to come back to this towards the end towards the end of the presentation here, and kind of how that ties into this larger message of targeted conservation enrollment. So with precision conservation largely, like I said, it's a multi-scale approach. There's various scales. I'm going to talk today about kind of two scales, a regional scale, and like I mentioned earlier, kind of strategically targeting at that regional level for an agency, but then more at our local or our field scale, working directly with the producer in their actual fields to identify those conservation opportunity areas. So some work that Ichi, Andrea Bache, and myself put together at kind of at a regional scale. We were replicating some work in Iowa State, and looking at basically the various different layers, soil productivity from the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, the county level yields, average cash rental rates, field input costs, et cetera, and looking at how basically combining that into a GIS platform and looking over 10 counties within southeast Nebraska, particularly because these 10 counties are dryland corn for most of those acres. And so where are there potential opportunities, even at a regional scale, where you're seeing net losses in corn profit across the board? And so what we were able to identify are some of these key areas that are noted here in with these circles that basically at a regional scale, we're seeing basically loss of revenue across the board. Now, there's obviously various reasons that may be impacting things at that scale. But really, this again, it's also, I should note that this is 1 year of data, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But the point is, even at a regional scale, we can identify potential opportunities where we could implement conservation across the board. And so we can actually take that model that we just mentioned, and we can identify some key variables that could be incorporated into it. So we can have species of interest, we can have land parcel sizes, we can have suitable wildlife habitat, we can have a proximity to urban centers, et cetera. And basically, and again, there's various variables that you can incorporate into this modeling input. This is just kind of a snapshot or an example. But then we basically start building a complex, basically prioritization model for private lands, where basically we incorporate not only our species ecology, so we're thinking here, I should back up. So looking at patch connectivity, dispersal and movements, looking at habitat selection, predator occupancy, et cetera. But then also bringing in our agricultural data and looking at how the agricultural data actually affects the prioritization process, just as I mentioned here a second ago. And so we can also incorporate other aspects. So distance to metro areas into our model. So as I mentioned in one of the previous slides in the challenges, obviously we want to be able to provide those opportunities across the board for folks. And then eventually we can get to this map, and it's kind of a pretty map of priority areas. And the idea is that these parcels that are in red are basically parcels in which met our criteria within those geographic space. And so these parcels potentially could be implemented at a regional scale for target areas to where you're going to prioritize conservation to optimize biodiversity. So again, we have that regional scale analysis. And so the question then is, okay, well, but is that like really telling you what's going on in the ground? So as I mentioned before, and I'm going to kind of back up a couple of slides here. I want to illustrate this with some of the work with Ichi and Andrea. This regional scale here that we have, this actually kind of at that level, the questions of, okay, is this, at that county level per se, is that really true? Well, obviously we need more data to kind of illustrate that, and whether that's a really true relationship that we're seeing there. But we really need that kind of field or that local scale level. So we'll kind of jump back here really quick to this idea of this local or field scale. So again, you have folks that are going into the FSA office, as I mentioned before, they're interested in conservation delivery, but maybe, you get a lot of folks that say, hey, you know what, I've heard about CRP, for example. I would just be very interested to see, what would work on my property. So we can actually, using spatial data, we can actually spatially identify conservation eligibility using hydrography layers, soil maps, field boundaries, soil rental rates, etc. And some work from some of my colleagues, Mark McConnell and Wes Berger out of Mississippi State University, they actually are piloting a tool in this right now, where basically they can utilize different layers, as I mentioned here, and identify on a farm what areas are eligible for various conservation programs. Obviously, every conservation program is going to have various different criteria, and so that's important. And so they've actually are building that or have built that into a modeling framework. So we can do this at a spatially identified conservation eligibility. But that doesn't tell the whole picture. So it can just say, hey, well, that's really cool. And if we kind of look at this image here, you have a lot of potentially eligible areas, but that's just not realistic to enroll all of those areas. One, because that's, we don't have enough money, as I mentioned before, but we need to also know, are those areas potentially in marginal acres that may make more sense? In other words, if you're trying to implement conservation, you don't want to necessarily put a conservation buffer in a highly profitable part of an agricultural field. One, because you're probably not going to get any excitement from that producer because they know that that's a highly profitable area or produces fairly well. But obviously, you're trying to maximize the whole field profitability is kind of your end goal with that local scale. So historically, one of the things we can use is basically historical yield monitor data. And basically, yield monitor data, for those who are not aware, basically it's, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details on it, but as that corn or soybeans or whatever crop is coming through into the system, that system has been calibrated to identify and basically calculate, basically taking GPS locations literally every second of what's going on and basically calculating an estimated yield for that section of the field. Now, obviously, there is a little time delay in there, but it's very minimal. So it kind of gives you this image here you get to see where you kind of have the red in the background showing maybe an area that's not very profitable, or basically the yield is very low. And then you get these more green areas, dark green areas where it's showing a higher yield estimate. But you can kind of convey to some level the profitability, but really that's not incorporated necessarily into, obviously into a combine, for example, where because you have Case, John Deere, and other various companies, there's a lot of different economics that could go into that calculation. So the question is, how do you build a model where we can actually have different farm management input costs, so things like seed cost, diesel costs, etc., where we can then actually create a profitability surface. Well, Mark and them have been working on this for the past several years, and have actually, again, they've built this into the tool that they've actually are implementing. And you can eventually get to, with incorporating yield monitor data, you can also incorporate commodity price, conservation payments, farm production costs. And something that I'm really interested in extending on to some of the ideas that they started is looking at alternative sources of revenue. So we can take these marginal areas that are noted in red in this image up here, that are basically, that are not getting profits off of. And I should note that you're looking at multiple years of yield monitor data. You're not looking at 1 year, because you need to have multiple years as we think about the long term of that data, making sure that that is consistently marginal. And so we can take those marginal areas and we can put them into alternative management options. So again, as I mentioned, hunting leases, grazing acres, etc. So now you start going back to one of those original graphs I showed about crop diversity. Then you can start seeing eventually a trend in the landscape diversity and getting more diversity that a lot of wildlife species tend to prefer on the landscape. So it can be done. It has been done, and some of my colleagues even out in North Dakota have actually implemented this. This is a field in corn production field in 2015. So you can see here that that individual is losing money on that field. That area is consistently marginal. And so what did they do? They took and chopped that section off so it wouldn't be an issue for their equipment when they're getting through there. They can still farm that as just like a farm edge per se. But then they put it in pasture and they put cattle on that. And now you take that one field and you start multiplying it across the many operations, the many fields that people have. You can start really increasing the overall profit across the board. And again, you're diversifying the landscape, but this in a way to be able to not only benefit the producer, so they're making more money in the long term, but at the same time, you're also benefiting our natural resources. So not only wildlife habitat, but obviously reducing soil erosion, water quality, addressing water quality issues, etc. There's additional options that you can also include, like I mentioned with the hunting, grazing acres, cover crops. I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about with the hunting, I've seen more places where maybe it's an area of a field that's regularly inundated with water. Maybe it's a wetland area, or it's just an area that just has very poorly drained soils. And so, most of the producers I've interacted with, most of them can take you to some of these areas and say, I just really don't get much out of this section of the field every year. It just doesn't, seem to produce fairly well. So what we can do is we can take that area, say it was a wetland area, we could actually say, okay, we're going to lease out that section of your property for whatever X amount of money you're interested in leasing it out for to waterfowl hunters. Similarly, for deer hunters or upland game bird hunters, you could take a section of a field and you could say, hey, I want to save X number of corn rows or soybean rows just to have some food resources on the landscape, so that or also covering the landscape for pheasants, for deer, whatever. So then I can actually have basically a payment I'm getting from the hunters that are going to come there and hunt on those sections of my property. So again, you're farming the best, conserving the rest. And that's from Pheasants Forever. That's kind of their motto in thinking about using precision conservation ideas. So as I mentioned, you kind of have this kind of multi-scale approach. You got a regional scale, and you do have some kind of intermediate scales, but I want to kind of talk largely about this regional versus local. So obviously I kind of translating down to that field scale, and then in turn kind of that field scale scaling back up per se to a region. And so that's part of the work that, again, Yichi and Andrea Bache and I are working on right now. We're basically with an NRCS grant. We're looking at basically the connection of the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index to yield monitor data to see how well that yield monitor data, that index, that crop index, productivity index, correlates to the yields on the ground, with the intent that layer could actually be very informative over the long term, because again, it's using soil properties to identify those areas that are more productive across the state. And it's basically a national layer, but we want to be able to connect that and see how well that potentially can identify those consistently marginal areas, which then in turn could be implemented into a geospatial decision support tool to be able to help conservation agencies implement conservation more strategically on the landscape. So then, we kind of learned a little bit about these two scales, but the question is, thinking about Nebraska, how can this idea even be successful? And I think one of the things that we have to really take, especially if you haven't grown up in a farm, and kind of think about from a farmer's perspective, we have to make money for both of the crop and say the CRP or conservation acres. Because if those acres are not really making me money, then essentially, why should I put them in that program? That's just reality. And I kind of always go back to the idea of, okay, when you put yourself in their shoes, you got seed costs, diesel costs, all these associated farm management costs. You have to pay that off every year or pay it off over a series of years. And so you don't want to be in the red constantly. You want to start moving towards that black. And so you're making money in the land. So that's why I always say that really every acre does count. And that's why we obviously have very intensive, kind of fence row to fence row corn and soybean operations, especially in eastern part of Nebraska, because every acre does count. And we have to think about that when we're thinking about how we can implement that, even from kind of the extension side as part of my job and interacting with producers on the ground. So as I mentioned before, we have this traditional conservation enrollment. Again, I kind of refer to it to some level as kind of a shotgun pattern approach. And a part of that, like I said, is I think you have obviously limitations financially. It's not unlimited funding. We can enroll every acre or every farm, but you also have human dimensions kind of components where maybe you have certain individuals that are maybe not really interested in some of those ideas. So there's a lot of different competing things that are going into that decision-making process. But I do think we can eventually, with this idea, we can, when I talked about precision conservation, we can move towards this approach of conservation cooperatives, or CCs, as I refer to them. And basically where you're going to have multiple farms within that zone, where you can then maybe strategically, target and meeting with those landowners, providing marketing materials. I know Missouri Department of Wildlife, they've actually have done that. They utilizing kind of identifying landowners, and that helps them in sending out their market materials more strategically on the landscape. And so again, you have limited resources. What do you do? How do you do that more strategically? It also lets us, provides us with an opportunity to really let the landowner sell these ideas of conservation cooperatives. I grew up in a farming community in Pennsylvania. I raised market lambs. We had horses as well. I was an FFA 4-H, and I understand the perspectives from a farmer, and at least in kind of the idea of, hey, I got to make these areas profitable. Well, it also is really important when we think about, hey, if I'm going to let the researcher tell me about this versus I would like to have my friend Joe down the road who's actually implemented some of these ideas, let them sell the approach. And we've seen this to be very successful. I've heard various stories where you'd have individuals are very influential in their local communities that have adopted some of these conservation initiatives or programs on their property, and then through various extension efforts, letting them essentially sell the idea to their neighbors. And then you kind of get to some level that ripple in the pond effect. It's not perfect, obviously, because there's a lot of different issues that can arise. But the point is that you let individuals that are connected in those communities sell the ideas. And so really the benefits in my mind of these conservation cooperatives, it really is allowing those neighbors, your local folks, tell the story of the land. Tell about how they can implement conservation to maximize the whole field, whole farm profitability, helping at the same time those our natural resources, reducing soil erosion, reducing water runoff, benefiting our wildlife populations across the board. And I should note really quickly that there's some work out of Iowa State. They have prairie strips where they're implementing in corn bean rotations, and they're basically taking about 10% of corn and bean fields and putting those into perennial vegetation strips. One of the things that stood out from some of their research to me, and talking with some producers, is they were seeing just with 10% of that field, that corn or bean field in a perennial vegetation strip, they were seeing anywhere from 30 to 40% reduction in water runoff. and they were up to 20 times increase on soil retention by just having a 10% of that field in a prairie vegetation strip, perennial vegetation strip. The point is that then by working with those folks, showing the landowners, hey, look at all this, look at the benefits you're having, then we can allow them to tell the story to their neighbors to be able to increase adoption across the board. As I mentioned also, it maximizes landscape diversification and finances across the board. And we can, again, these conservation zones, we can actually implement ideas with ecotourism, and that kind of leads to my next slide here. With the Schweitzer Ranch and the Calamus Outfitters, and they realize this. They realize in diversifying their operation from not just being a cattle operation, but to then think about all the other experiences of having people come out here, bird watch, come out and right by the Calamus Reservoir, there's opportunities to stay there and just experience nature and experience working or basically living on for a period of time. This is on a property where they're basically doing all of what I just discussed. They're basically kind of creating these win-win solutions across the board. And so that's where I think there's some really cool opportunities for ecotourism in the state of Nebraska and with these conservation cooperatives, and something that with my program that we're moving towards and with research and extension in the coming years. So to finish up here in the last couple of slides, I wanted to mention just kind of overview here again. Precision conservation delivery at that regional scale really helps in improving the patch connectivity for wildlife. So we're thinking about congregating, kind of allocating those patches more strategically on the landscape. We also have to think about that patch connectivity from the corridors. I've received a question in the past about, implementing corridor conservation. I think that is definitely important, and thinking beyond the patch. A lot of times we kind of, we think about, hey, I implemented a conservation program or I'm managing this property, but thinking about that property in the context of the larger landscape. And so zooming out, as we showed earlier, and looking at where are the other patches on the landscape. And kind of putting yourself in the mindset of a pheasant or whatever, and saying, hey, if I had to get from that place to over here, how would I get there? And so that corridor establishment is also really critical when we think about that. And obviously this idea of kind of patch connectivity also has effects on the genetics or landscape genetics for species. So obviously as patches become more isolated, you're going to see that changes that genetic diversity over time. And so that's really important, especially in intensive agricultural landscapes. As I mentioned too, the targeting of the limited financial resources, being able to do this more strategically. And this is a component of what our lab is focused on and working in this area, to be able to help our state, federal NGOs to be more strategic in how they implement the limited financial resources that they have available. And working with them, it's not, and again, like I mentioned, with the complexity of some of the models that create these figures, you can get into numerous different variables that can actually affect the decision making on the ground. And it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship. Just because this identifies some target areas, you also have a human component of that, and that's working with the neighbors in there. And then that's why it's so critical to have support, particularly in my role as extension, to be able to help engage in that and continue to train up other biologists and land managers to be able to address some of these issues. And then additionally is that habitat loss. We talked about that right at the beginning of the presentation, and thinking about how we can actually reduce habitat loss at the same time as actually maximizing the whole field profitability and maximizing the overall production for farmers so that they are making more money, but simultaneously you're reducing these impacts on the landscape. And then, like I said, you're having this input, this aspect of increased profits. If we can turn those red areas green by putting conservation there, now you're actually helping create those win-win solutions across the board. So with that, I will wrap up the presentation, and I'm happy to address any questions. There's my contact information. Go follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, The Awesome Lab. Again, if there's some time for questions, I'll be more than happy to address them.
Andy, we appreciate it. I just want to remind everyone that you can send the questions to either me or Chris, and we will ask Andy. Chris, I just want to make sure that you're not getting any, make sure I'm looking at the right place.
It takes a second here. Andy, I was wondering if maybe you could just speak to where Morgan and Corin's project are fitting in with this whole project.
Absolutely. So yeah, so Morgan, of course, who introduced me here, as well as Corin Winter, they started back in, I guess, in August. They're working on an environmental trust funded project looking at farmers and farmland owners' views to targeted conservation delivery, basically building on these ideas I talked about today, but kind of looking at it more so from the producer, the farmers and the landowners' eyes. You know, what are some of the barriers to conservation delivery on their property? You know, how do you deal with, you know, when you have absentee landowners? That's a huge challenge. Maybe that individual who owns that land lives in New York City. Well, you have somebody leasing that land and they potentially could be hesitant to approach the owner because they don't want to lose the lease on that property. And so part of their project is basically going to be addressing through a series of surveys and basically kind of focus groups or semi-structured interviews, addressing some of these questions and trying to figure out how do we collectively as a team, not just you know farmers, not just conservation agencies, but as a team, how do we work together collectively across the board? And in addition to that, we also have a separate planning grant through the University of Nebraska NU system, where we're convening a group which will have about 20 to 25 folks from agency personnel to agribusiness, farmers, farmland owners on this group. In it, Drew Tyre, Kevin Pope, several others are part of that project, and basically looking at how do we work together as a team to solve these issues, given what we're seeing on the landscape, all those challenges. Because if we're not proactive and we become more reactive, you know, thinking about how management's going to look like in 50 years from now, we need to be on the side of being proactive. And that's really, you know, these grants are really aimed at that and trying to work collectively as a team to solve those complex issues.
Thank you. We have a couple questions. So the first one says, do you have any estimate how much nitrate leaching can be reduced by following these conservation practices?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I would refer to some of our folks, water and soil folks, to help out on that.
Alrighty, the next question is from Tyler. It says, what would these connecting corridors look like and how would you implement them?
It's a great question. So I would say that there's what they look like is going to be very dependent on the landscape structure. I wouldn't say there's any cookie cutter approach, and how you would implement them. There potentially could be through alternative conservation programs or other funding sources. There was a paper that came out in 2019 that really challenged looking at basically the financial aspect of our conservation programs and looking at, we have to think broader and how we're going to implement conservation over the next 50 to 100 years. Because again, if we're relying solely on farm bill funding, we're not going to have enough money to implement these ideas. And so we have to look at alternative options that are out there to fund these type of initiatives. And an example of a corridor, and I've been thinking this is because my interest in, especially in deer, University of Wyoming has been doing a lot of work with mule deer and looking at corridors in Wyoming. And there's now big basically migration initiatives and corridor initiatives that are actually being funded through the federal government to basically establish those corridors as key areas for conservation on the landscape. So my point in using them as an illustration is that's a way to potentially look at maybe there's another option of corridor establishment through other programs down the road.
The next question is from Jessica, and she says, "Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if there is a way in which agricultural produce grown in areas with the conservation corridors could get a premium. Could a certification be created?"
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's potentially possible. Again, there's a lot of policy on that side of things. But I know that's especially in Nebraska, there's been a lot of discussions around taxation on the land, and how do you conservation taxation per se versus having that in just agricultural land, and how that potentially changes the taxes that you have. And so I think if there's ways that we can kind of turn that around and look at it more from if you're doing these things, you kind of get credits, kind of like the idea of like carbon credits, that kind of idea, credits for being able to manage that way. Again, that takes more of the policy, the political side of things. I think there's definitely a possibility of that. So, sorry if you hear my dog in the background. So.
We have a question from Matt who says, "Do corridors need to be species specific so that they attract the intended animals?"
Do they need to be species specific? I would say when we think about managing habitat for wildlife in general, yes, we sometimes can have a very targeted approach on certain species, but I would suggest, going back to the idea I mentioned before, kind of umbrella species. So thinking about species that may have more general requirements, but then provide resources for various other wildlife, I think is really important.
Alrighty, we have two questions from Aaron. The first one I have is, how would you decrease predation in the conservation islands that are being created?
How would you decrease predation? So that's a great question. When you get those ecological traps, I will say that, basically typically, folks would basically trap predators in those areas. The way I've kind of viewed it is really moving more towards the idea of not having the ecological sinks, but trying to work to expand that. So some work I did with my PhD on wild turkeys is basically we looked where you had areas that was almost kind of it was heterogeneous landscape in the understory, because there's a lot of really successional habitat through prescribed fire, but it was really, in my mind, kind of a homogeneous landscape. And looking at kind of how the predation in there, we found with turkeys, particularly with turkey nests, because there was so much available habitat, it made it almost impossible for predators to find those nests. So I think it's really important to kind of think more about the landscape and how you would try to approach it that way more so.
Alrighty, and then the second question that he had is very interesting. It says, how would you address habitats in which prior to European settlement, bison would trample the long, more fibrous grasses, leading to growth of the more nutritious grasses? The lack of migratory herds is thought to be associated with habitat degradation in semi-arid and seasonal wet grasslands.
So how would you address that? Is that the question?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. So obviously, the ideal situation would be if we didn't, we were basically in the, kind of early settlement times or pre-settlement times, you'd have bison out in the landscape that, large scale. That's obviously not realistic nowadays, at least not at a large scale, because of the numerous private landowners that you have out there. And so through various, grazing options, through various intensive habitat management options that agencies like Game and Parks and Pheasants Forever implement, you can basically work on trying to implement more strategic habitat management on those properties, but you may never get back necessarily to what it would have been, pre-settlement times. But I think you can have some really tremendous success, particularly we think about, eastern red cedars and controlling them with fire and using fire, prescribed fire for early successional plant communities, creating that. We have various tools in the toolbox, and so it doesn't necessarily fall into one category or another. I think it's really kind of about utilizing multiple tools to achieve those overall objectives that you have for your property.
Alrighty, and I don't think we have any more questions at this time, at least, but I just wanted to say thank you again for presenting to us today.
Yeah.
I'm obviously biased, but I think it was really good. But,
Well, if
yeah.
anybody has any other questions, you can feel free to shoot me an email at alittle6@unl.edu, and I'm more than happy to address any of them.
Alrighty, thank you.
All right, sounds good. We'll see y'all.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Morgan.